Hello, everyone, and welcome to a bonus stream in April. We have a really cool show today. You know, for those of you who've been a part of the community for a while now, you know that on a yearly basis, we kind of interact with different content creators who have been with the Ashes of Creation community for a while now. And I am joined by three of our very amazing content creators, and they also, manage their own communities who are very excited for Ashes of Creation, and they've compiled a really cool list of questions that I'm excited to answer with them today. I have not previewed these questions, so I heard that some of them might be fun, some of them might be a little spicy. We'll see, but I would love to go around with each of you and have you guys introduce yourselves and your channels and your community, and just kind of give a little introduction. Why don't we start with you, Simurg?
Oh yeah, so my name's Samorg, and I am the host of the Ashes Pathfinders podcast and run the community site asheshq.com. So that's pretty much where you can find us doing our thing pretty regularly. We're pretty stoked about Ashes.
Yeah, I jump on and I listen to your guys' podcasts every now and then that you have with some of the guests, and also when you do the reviews of the live streams and stuff. You have a very
Yeah.
active community, and I love to see the questions and the banter and the kind of go back and forth and whatnot. We also have with us Mr. Richie SH. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Very good. Tell us a
Good.
little bit about yourself and your channel.
My channel's Richie SH over on YouTube. I cover all sorts of Ashes of Creation news. I cover tweets, Discord chat, all sorts of things to get, every bit of information we possibly can.
Every little piece of morsel possible. And then we also have a regular, our one and only Chibi. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you so much. I hope you're doing well also.
I was getting sick last week during the live stream. I got sick that Thursday, and I am almost out the other side. This one was a doozy. Um, it was definitely a rough one, but I'm feeling much better today, and I'm excited to be here with you. Tell us a little bit about your channel and what you do with Ashes.
So I am a co-host of The Golden Feather, which is a community-based kind of interview and opinion podcast where we usually get to know our guest and also get to know the community's opinions on topics that the community is generally talking about. So I have some of my questions are kind of in that style.
Very cool. Well, I love the opportunity to kind of sit down with members of the community, especially you guys who have been following Ashes for such a long time. Obviously, there are different tiers of content creators who kind of follow Ashes on and off, kind of bring updates to their communities. But you guys have been following for a very long time. You're very core central members of the community, and you represent, I think, a cross section of followers and fans who have been relatively up to date with what the game is intending to be, the philosophy of our designs, and been here from the very beginning. So it's always good because when we do live streams or other types of quote unquote marketing events where I might do interviews with content creators and whatnot, sometimes those are done within the context of the new audience, right? Who might we be speaking to that has never heard of Ashes before? But today I think we're going to be a little bit different there. We're going to be speaking to more of our core audience with the types of questions that you guys want to ask, and those of you who have been following the project for a long time and have been through the journey with us of what it's come to be to make this game. So that's always exciting for me. And I apologize. I have a cough drop, so I don't cough too much. Well, that's why might be why I'm sounding a little bit strange. But with that being said, how have you guys been doing? How'd you guys enjoy the last update?
I loved it. I thought it was great. Seeing the story arcs starting to come together is pretty cool.
Yeah, it was something that we haven't really shown before. Obviously, we've talked a lot about since the beginning of time for Ashes back in 2017 about a changing world and whatnot. But I don't think people really had the opportunity to have seen what systems are associated with that. They got a little bit of a touch on it with the Weathers and Seasons, and now they get to see that both from a story arc perspective as well as how we intend to facilitate those story arcs across the world. I thought it was cool. I love seeing the transition to that zone over into over into the Blood is Due story arc. I thought it was super cool. And Carfin is such a giant tower. One of my favorite things that I enjoyed in previous MMOs was these tall vertical dungeons. In Lineage, they had a really cool one called Kruma Tower that you got when you were like level 40-ish, and Tower of Insolence that you got when you were like a little bit endgame. And I really always enjoyed, going through those towers and the different rooms of that dungeon, competing and fighting for for where I could hunt or where I might get PK'd or get trained a bunch of mobs on. I don't know if you guys ever had that experience in your MMO play.
Yeah, definitely watched you have that a lot on the live streams.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was super cool. Well, let us get to some of your questions. I am super excited to just for you guys who are tuning in, this is going to be a Q&A primarily. We're going to just shoot the poop, so to speak, and talk a little bit about Ashes and some of the questions that the communities have expressed to these guys. So what do you guys got for me?
So my first question, and as I mentioned, these are going to reflect kind of our TGF Tavern podcast theme. So my first question is a little bit of an icebreaker. What are the most challenging and most enjoyable things you have found about running the studio? With these in mind, what is your biggest lesson learned throughout the process?
What have been the most challenging and exciting things I've experienced in running the studio? Well, that is a big question. For those of you who don't know my history, I started Intrepid with my husband John back in 2016. Really, it was when we hired our first our first employees. I think was John Arellano and Keith Kovac. It was December of 2015, actually. Sorry, December of 2015. And it really came from a point of me as a player. I was kind of upset with the state of MMOs, and I've been a huge MMO fan for a very long time. I've played a lot of MMOs, and we had an opportunity with some of the talent here in San Diego from formerly Sony Online Entertainment and some great MMO franchises that were built to attract an audience of developers who were going to be interested in building the next best MMO possible. And I didn't know much about development at the time. I knew a lot about designs and systems because I had run my own campaigns in D&D and Pathfinder, and that's what Ashes of Creation is predicated on, with what it's built off of is off of that campaign in Pathfinder. And so I had a very kind of understanding design-wise of these systems that I've experienced and were inspired from in other MMOs that I have played in, and I thought how cool it would be to integrate those systems into a comprehensive and cohesive design theory around risk versus reward, and not everybody's a winner, and a little bit more of a throwback to more old school design feel and whatnot. So for me, starting studio was a fire hose of information, of learning. The first couple of years, just sitting very closely with each of my lead developers and digesting as much as possible from their experiences in previous companies and previous projects. And that was a very difficult task, to learn as much as I did in such a short period of time, and still to continue learning that. What I would say the most fun aspect of having led an MMO studio now for the last over 6 years has been to watch the team grow and change. It's a very different feeling when you're a group of half dozen to a dozen people growing to a couple dozen people, growing to dozens of people, growing to 150 plus people. Like, that experience, these different thresholds of studio size, while maintaining the culture of what Intrepid is, which is a place for gamers to build games that they love. Um, that has been a really rewarding experience, to see the connections, to see the friendships formed, to see the bonds created, to see the camaraderie, the collective desire and motivation to create something that stands the test of time, that makes your audience proud, that makes you yourself want to play the game. Like, that is something that is a sight to behold. The second most exciting thing, I think, for me has always been the opportunity to interface and talk to other gamers, people who are excited. I get a taste of this on a Reddit, I get a taste of this on the forums or through different YouTube channels and Twitter and Discord. A large portion of my initial environment and how I talk to players was through Discord. But I think that the pinnacle of that experience was going to PAXs and having an opportunity to sit down and hear directly from the player what's inspirational about Ashes. What is the core philosophy that speaks to you as a gamer? And it's each person's different. What speaks to them, right? Because we're all eclectic and have our own backgrounds and pasts and experiences that we want to relive, and the nostalgia that we want to experience again. So. Just kind of finding what that common ground is between us as gamers. That was fun to experience and see people with just literal excitement and opportunity to kind of chat with them, play Magic with them, play board games, and hang out after the events. That was a super fun thing for me. What has been the most challenging? Um, Obviously the most challenging thing for me was learning everything I needed to learn in a very short period of time, and then continuing to learn and evolve from there. If I were to give another answer on the challenging aspect from a development perspective, it's integrating, I feel, this transparent process with the creative and development side of a project. Typically, what people don't see what it takes to build these types of games. It's ugly, it's hard, it's iterative, it takes so much imagination to look at what you're seeing in a functional setting and imagine it in a testable and then eventually polished and shippable setting, right? That is a logical leap of creativity that it takes to get from this has no VFX, this has no sound design, this has no polished animation, this has nothing. And I'm not talking about what you guys see, because we take that up to close to a shippable quality. But when you see it in a very bare bones setting, it can be difficult. It can be challenging to imagine it in its next step of iteration and work, and then have to make decisions based off of that. Is a challenge, a challenging thing to do, but very rewarding as well. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question.
All right. My first question is, which zones can we expect to see in Alpha 2, and how many of them are in a comparable state to the Riverlands, and how far along in development they are?
Ooh, that's a big question. We have a lot of zones that are planned for Alpha 2. Not all of them will be online by the time Alpha 2 launches, but they will be continuously integrated and launched as part of Alpha 2 continuing forward. The big areas obviously are the Riverlands, the Badlands, the Sandsquall Desert, the Tropics, the forest areas, some of the tabletop mountains and the tundra and ice areas. And then we want to obviously have the loops around our naval zones, partly represented. I apologize for coughing, guys. Or as some called our last week's preview, the Tower of Coffin. That was good. But yeah, so there's a lot of areas that are planned. When we talk about like level of completion, what goes into really making a particular zone? Obviously, there's the terrain, there's the foliage, there's setting up small points of interest, medium points of interest, large points of interest. There's connecting the quest hubs into those points of interest. There's setting up the nodes within those localities. There's the overland population, the spawner work that needs to be kind of set up, narrative and storylines and how they connect outside of that particular zone. There's the resource tables and materials. There's a lot that really kind of goes into that. So as we kind of accomplish setting up each of these zones incrementally, different parts of the team come and touch the zones at different points in the pipeline. So first, environment kind of gets in there and they set up the terrain and kind of the block out for all of the level design across that particular zone in conjunction with the level design team, who's Ben and Jason and Jeremy kind of work with them on that front. And then once those kind of areas are set up and the POIs get blocked out, that's when narrative teams start assigning quest locations, quest markers, and setting those up, while nodes is kind of setting up the base node areas as well. So it depends on the zone where it's at from a level of completion standpoint and who's kind of touched it. It would be a long list to kind of run down and go through each of those. But I would say generally when we talk about in preparation for Alpha 2, we bring the zones that are intended to launch with somewhere between like a 60 to 70% completion perspective before it's ready for an Alpha 2. And then that's where you would expect players to kind of participate in those zones during Alpha 2.
Cool. So this one's going to be related to lore. Could you elaborate on how the soul as a conduit may tie into other realms or planes? Again, assuming those are actually different things, or possibly even the avatars of the gods, which you've previously mentioned.
Ooh, I need to be careful on this one. And I don't know how much I've gone into this in the past and how much is revealing maybe too much right now. But okay, so to understand what the mortal coil is, what we call the mortal coil, there is some base metaphysical understanding that's required of kind of the universe of Ashes of Creation, or quote unquote universes, I suppose. And at the crux of each is this concept of the flow of essence, the river of essence, we might call it, right? And essence is really all that can come to be comes from, in some way, shape, or form, the essence. And in the original kind of Ashes of Creation Pathfinder campaign that I had built long ago, I'll just kind of talk a little bit to that and let you guys discover what may have changed in Ashes of Creation. But in that sense, there was very much this concept of planar locations, or different planes that existed within the universe. Some things existed on the material plane, some things existed on the ethereal plane, on the celestial plane. There are a number of planes that kind of exist. And essence flows like a river through each of the planes. And the higher up you go in these planes, the closer to the source of the essence you really are. And that's where you can see stronger manifestations of, the magical aspects of the essence. Now, so I'm sorry, let me make sure I'm touching on the right point in the question. Can you re-ask the question just one more time for me?
Sure.
Oh,
yeah.
I see it actually on the screen. Okay, sorry. No, elaborate more of how the soul. Okay, got it. So, when the divine races were created by the pantheon of gods, they were created for a particular purpose, and the purpose they were created for was to observe how these mortal beings would interface with a substance like the essence. And obviously, one of the great differentiators between mortal divine races and the gods is that aspect of mortality. And one of the ways that the divine races were created in order to interact with the essence was through the use of a mortal coil. And that mortal coil was malleable. Your soul was malleable. It could change to adopt a greater a greater connection with the essence around one particular school of magic, perhaps, or one type of magic that you might use essence for. And the more you experienced that, the more adept you became with utilizing that magic. And that's because your coil would start to mold itself to best facilitate that flow of essence, whatever school of magic you were manipulating with it, right? And so, in that sense, when you have the story of the original ancients, the predecessor race to the divine races, their coil began to warp and change to best facilitate essence through the use of corruption and corrupt magic, because it was in their story, in their history, that they learned the most powerful use, or at least what they believed was the most powerful use of essence, was through corrupt magic, and that's what allured them towards it. So to give you better context about why that conduit is so important is, as your base character, as your core archetype continually learns and manifests things in the world of Verra through the use of the essence, it will continue to shape and change its conduit towards that purpose. Now, how does the soul act as a conduit to the other races, to the other realms? Remember, that essence is like a river that flows through the plains. And when it touches mortal coils that use it in a certain way, it has reverberations throughout the river that is felt across the plains. And that's how important the divine races are when it comes to the war over their soul, so to speak, is what impact it has across the universe, so to speak. So hopefully that answers some of your questions. And then I see, let's see, possible avatars of the gods, which have previously been mentioned. We've talked a little bit about them. I don't want to give them away too much, because they are core characters within some of the storylines. But obviously, the Phoenix is an avatar. And so that kind of gives you an example of the types of mythos and mythological creatures that we lean into to kind of represent the avatars of the gods.
All right. My next question is, will the Alpha 2 map include any portion of the Eastern continent?
Eventually it will. Yes. At launch, it might not. It depends. Depends on how much progress we make towards that end. It is not required for us to begin testing. Let's just say that. And so if it makes it by the time we want to launch Alpha 2, then we will include it. Otherwise, it will be released at a later time during the Alpha 2 test.
All right. Did the Underrealm size increase when you expanded the size of the world map, or is it still expected to be about 100 square kilometers?
It didn't increase too much. There is going to be some level of additional scope that's necessary on the Underrealm. Again, to reiterate the intent of the Underrealm, in areas where you have overland transit and movement between zones, the Underrealm is meant to provide an alternate path, so that you are not creating these kind of congested environments where it is just too easy to gank someone who's moving material goods, like through a caravan in a particular choke point. It's kind of offering alternative paths that can exist for players to utilize as necessary. And so in that sense, even though the size of the map grew, those choke points remained relatively similar, right? They're designed for a particular player count as a conjunction between different zones. And so the Underrealm, in order to facilitate that alternate path idea, did not have to increase in size too much.
Cool. So the next question for the Pathfinders is that you've mentioned milestones a lot. Is there any chance you could elaborate on what these different milestones or goalposts are in order to provide some added transparency without promising dates?
Elaborate on these different milestones or goalposts. Well, there is a lot that gets done in a particular milestone. To give you kind of understanding from our internal kind of production schedule perspective. Milestones consist of multiple sprints worth of work, right? And these sprints are kind of small increments of time that a particular development team might work towards a goal, completing a feature, um, or content pass that's necessary in a particular area. And so when we set up our milestones and we are kind of identifying what those particular milestone goals are, they span across the entirety of development, from platform and engineering to design and concept to combat iteration and counter design, through model creation and VFX and our tools adjustments and iteration, and environment build outs, and everything that goes into making a game. Everyone is kind of involved in this concentrated and cooperative effort to achieve a particular milestone. Now, we talk about these milestones every month that we do a live stream. You see the fruit of these milestones, whether it be in the assets that get created that we talk about, or a particular feature that we want to show off, its development, as it's been kind of fleshed out further. So each month, you guys in the community get insight into what was a part of this particular milestone. And when we talk about upcoming presentations and upcoming live streams, you're getting insight, I think, into what's part of our internal scope. Now, obviously, we don't share our internal milestones because they're very fluid and subject to change. We're an agile development team, which means that between sprints, it becomes necessary for us to make pivots, for us to make priority changes as it exists within our backlog, and a lot of that is driven by desired testing we need to get done internally, or when we discover undiscovered work, or we develop tech debt. Like, there are reasons why those milestones change. The scope and or objectives of a particular milestone might change from sprint to sprint, ever so slightly, but the goals are always what we are aiming to achieve, and stay consistent. So we don't share those because it is a very agile, fluid environment, where particular objectives of a milestone might be relatively fluid.
And going back to the Underrealm, will there be larger bodies of water like oceans, lakes, or rivers in the Underrealm? And if so, will we be able to use boats or ships to navigate them?
There will absolutely be underrealm lakes and rivers. Those will be locations, and very important ones, for unique material goods like certain types of fish, that players will be able to go down and fish with. But there will not be the use of boats and vehicles within the water vehicles of the Underrealm, at least not for launch.
All right. If everything goes relatively smoothly, how long are you anticipating Alpha 2 to run for? And if it goes longer than anticipated, how do you continue to keep players and the viewers interested for that long without feeling the burnout of seeing all the content?
Well, Alpha 2 will not be content complete. That's the first thing. The other thing is, when talking about kind of burnout, I think that's something that we adapt to during the testing period. We kind of observe how players are buying on to the particular testing that's available. If we need to consolidate that testing, if we need to wipe that testing. We talk about the length of Alpha 2. Alpha 2 is intended to exist up until launch. There's going to be different testing periods that we will be releasing either new content locations or zones or systems that we want to have players kind of focus in on. In those situations, if we're having participation drought because of the length of Alpha 2, we can set them up in a more focused setting. We can even incentivize that. We can offer unique testing to potentially um, new testers as well. It's important to note that Alpha 2 and our alphas are not what traditional alphas have been that many players have experienced, which are usually completed games that are being ported over or moved over into a new region for publishing purposes, and they're selling access to alpha as at a higher price point of exclusivity, in order to start off that product launch with a bang in the new territory. That's what traditionally players in Western audiences are accustomed to, are these Eastern ported over MMOs and their quote unquote alphas, which are really just stress tests environments for a completed game in a server. Ours are very much traditional alphas. And what that means is the game is not complete. The game is in a very core functionality perspective. Alpha 2 will be a bit more than that, obviously, than Alpha 1 was. Those of you who participated in Alpha 1 saw just the basics and core functionality of the game, seeing nodes get stood up, seeing nodes collect experience and threshold, and having some service buildings you could build, and character progression, and skills and abilities, and dungeons, and bosses and monsters, and some basic crafting and questing. Like that was that was Alpha 1. Now that was a large environment. It was 64 plus square kilometers, I think, of space. But Alpha 2 is a much more fleshed out version of what Ashes of Creation is. And so in that sense, it's still important to keep in mind it is not a finished product. And there's still a lot of stuff to be done. But this is an opportunity for us, again, to touch point with the community and say, okay, on these particular systems, on these particular content passes, on these particular gameplay features and loops like combat and whatnot, how do you want to see changes? And then we validate what those change desires are against what our intended list of deliverables already are, ensure that there's one-to-one parallelism there. And then if there are things that we didn't see, we evaluate based off of feedback from players if we should incorporate them or iterate upon the existing designs. Hopefully that answered your question.
All right, so this one's about the cosmetic store in Freeholds. When are we going to get answers on the point regarding what the cosmetic skins correlate to on Freeholds? As it's been quite some time now since people have been waiting for an answer on that.
Yeah. So the majority of cosmetic Freehold skins, the vast majority of them are used for the home. And to give you an example, kind of an idea of how the Freehold is partitioned, Freehold serves kind of three main purposes. The first and foremost is as a location for your home. And so because of that, a portion of the Freehold is dedicated to a home building. And you cannot fill that space with workshops and or processing stations other than to place a home there. The home offers a lot of things, and the reasons why it's a core element of Freeholds is because of storage capability. Excuse me. Storage capability, furniture allotment and placement. Furniture interacts very closely with processing, as well as the crop rotations that exist around the particular housing building. The other portion of the Freehold is dedicated to workshops and these processing stations, essentially. And processing stations are, of course, a necessary component of taking gatherables into usable, crafted goods, essentially, to fulfill what recipes require in order to make items. And so the majority of cosmetics that are out there from our pre-order packages are dedicated to that Freehold housing slot. Now, some are used for the workstations, and it is the intent that our designs facilitate multiple applicable cosmetics skins to those workstations as well as to the house. So you'll see Freeholds that have the house applied cosmetic and some with the workstations applied. Why is it taking so long for Intrepid to provide clarification? So the unique thing about the Freehold approach in design is that there's a lot of testing that needs to be done around that. And in Alpha 2, we will have our Freeholds available to test. And while we have the designs in place for how processing interacts, for gathering, and how processing feeds the crafting stations, some of that stuff might change. The allotment of buildings that can be placed on the freehold, the way that the buildings get placed on the freehold, whether or not we even scrap the idea of dedicating a portion of the freehold towards the house. And because of that, because of the design limbo that's still pending our testing environment in Alpha 2, we've not wanted to kind of give definitive definition around how those cosmetics will be applied to the freehold buildings in the event that that might change based on iteration. But to give you perspective there, it's mainly going to be focused around the freehold house, and then also having the ability to apply the skins to some of the workstations as well. There is going to be a limited allotment of how many workstations you can have stood up at any given time. There's a limited allotment of licenses that can be applied to a freehold in order to make some of those stations reach level 2, tier 2 and tier 3. What those particularly are, we have some designs for them now, but that most likely will not survive testing and will need to be changed and adapted and iterated upon based off what the testing results provide. One other thing is that we don't really market our pre-order packages. We don't market our cosmetics. We don't spend any marketing dollars towards that end. And I want to reiterate something that I've always said in the past and will continue to say going forward. It is not necessary to pre-order Ashes of Creation. We do non-NDA'd testing periods. This is an opportunity where all of the community gets to see what some of the testers are experiencing in Alpha 1 and in Alpha 2. And to be perfectly honest, our testing environments are not catered or made for the enjoyment of players. It is not a game that you are purchasing when you make a pre-order into Alpha and Beta for Ashes of Creation. You are actually committing yourself to dedicating a portion of your time in testing specific loops that might not be fun in order to accurately provide us, the team, with information from a player invested perspective. And so in that sense, it is perfectly acceptable and desired that players who are cautious or questioning whether or not this is the game for them, some of the designs might speak to them or not, sit back and wait. You have an opportunity to watch development, to continue to opine and give your thoughts and feelings on something. And if the monetization structure of selling cosmetics is not your cup of tea, then by all means, do not participate that. There are plenty of games that are out there that do things differently. We're very upfront about how we want to operate with regards to no pay to win, no pay to convenience. Our cosmetics are available if players want to participate. They like collecting those things, that's fine. And they are part of building the world, right? These cosmetics get used as part of NPCs, they get used as part of unique buildings around different points of interest. They're already in line of production in order to build the world of Ashes. They're just also available as part of the cosmetic pre-order purchases as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
I'm going to actually go ahead and elaborate on the freehold. What happens if you have a freehold and a world event happens in the area? We know that some events can affect buildings. Can it also affect your freehold?
No. So the way that events work is there's a certain number of world conditions that can serve as predicates for whether or not an event, the event manager and the event system, which Clayton has done a great amount of work on whether or not these predicates satisfy the requirements in order to initiate an event. And those events have objectives. Some of those objectives might be centralized at points of interest. Some of the objectives might be centralized at a particular node. Some of those events might be predicated on a particular objective that's just randomly spawns out in the world in order to kind of create player activity and engagement and soft friction between players, right? The events do not target personal belongings. Which means that your freehold is essentially a personal belonging, right? It is a certificate, a deed in which you own, in which you have constructed the necessary requirements in order to stand up any particular building on that freehold. So in that sense, we don't want to create an event that targets you. We want we want to create events that target, engage, and incentivize your community. And there are a lot of different communities in the aspect of Ashes of Creation. Remember, we're a non-faction based game, which means we have to create a lot of micro communities. We have to create a lot of quote unquote pseudo factions. And the reason we create those pseudo factions, and they're opt-in, like I choose which node I'm a part of, I choose which social organization I'm a part of, I choose which religion I'm a part of, I choose which dungeon I choose to go and to XP at. The reason why we allow that amount of player agency is because we create complementary systems that incentivize soft friction between those communities, right? And events is one of those systems that helps to facilitate the soft friction between communities. So we don't want to focus them on an individual player. We want to focus them on the micro communities or the pseudo factions that that player has chosen to be a part of.
Right. How do you go about designing some of the more old school systems such as XP debt, minimal fast travel, and open world raiding that have really gone away for the most part in modern MMOs? And how do you design them to be accepted again by a new generation of gamers? And what made you decide to bring these back for Ashes to begin with?
God, that is such a question with a deeper root system than it appears to have, meaning that there's a lot that goes into that question. How do you design some of the more old school systems? Well, when looking at the reasoning behind why some of those old systems existed, a lot of it was centralized around the idea of risk versus reward. I mean, let's take a look at the three that you name: XP debt, minimal fast travel, and open world rating. Experience debt is a cost of failure. Experience debt is the bite of not achieving success. If I die to a monster because my strategy was bad, because my performance was bad, because my planning was bad, all of that means that debt is the cost I pay for the bad choice, right? And I think to skip, well, let me just go through the other two. Minimum fast travel. My location matters, and the time it travels there is the cost I pay, right? Open world rating. I'm not the only person interested in completing this objective. I have competition. That competition represents pressure. That pressure represents a desire to succeed and perform, right? All of those are touch points on player emotional connectivity. There is a reason why I want to succeed. Part of that reason can be incentivization through reward. Part of that reason can be incentivization through failure. So that's, I think, one of the core fundamental philosophies as to how you design some of the more old school systems. To answer the second part of the question, we have moved away from that modern MMOs. Modern MMOs have had a difficult time. Modern MMOs have had a difficult time because of really three main probably issues. The first and foremost is that the existing primary franchises of MMOs today, the big ones out there, the WoWs and the Final Fantasies and the Guild Wars and the BDOs, they've had a lot of time to create a social gravity well, which means that MMOs are very social environments. That's what MMOs do best. From a business perspective, that's why MMOs have long lifetime value for customers, because of the retention ability for that particular MMO to keep a customer returning. And it's because of these social environments, the guild structures, the cooperative questing environments, content completion that incentivizes people to work with one another to create friends, online friendships and environments. That is not the typical genre. That is not the FIFA sporting genre. That's not the first person shooter genre as much. It is not the, you can jump into those session based games as a solo player real easy and just kind of dip out when you're done and see your individual performance. From a MMO perspective, those existing franchises have a strong social gravity well. And so games, when they launched to compete with those existing franchises, they have wanted to remove friction. Their approach philosophically to game design theory has been, every time a player experiences friction, that is an opportunity for us to lose the player, right? And that can be a scary thought. Not that we place the emphasis or the reasoning behind why should a player emphasize the reward of success, because the taste of defeat can be bitter, right? And so that creates an investment for the player that's more long term. But some of the perspective of the new modern MMOs that have launched is, we need to make our money back, right? And we need to retain the user for as long as possible. Let's reduce the friction for that player and the opportunity for them to disassociate with the game at the taste of failure. And so that's been a lot of the reasoning behind why modern MMOs go more towards the realm of, everyone's a winner. You get a trophy and you get a trophy. Doesn't this trophy feel great? Big hoopla and rewards, and the screen is shaking and shining, and you've killed a trash monster. Now the whole world is jumping up in joy for you. Like, that is how I feel every time I jump into a new MMO. And to be honest, it sucks ass. Excuse me. It sucks, right? It is a bad experience. Oh my gosh, we have set ourselves to Margaret's gonna kill me. Okay, regardless, it is a trash experience. It does not feel good to be a winner every time, no matter what you do. That sucks. It feels good to lose sometimes. It is the duality of that experience that makes the feel good moments actually feel good. So, some more. I'm so sorry. So anyways, that's a little bit of a throwback to why that sometimes I get a little bit animated. So I apologize if there's anybody who's not accustomed to that language. But regardless, that is one of the reasons why I think modern MMOs moved away. A couple other reasons, of course, why is there's a lot of content that those older MMOs had the opportunity to kind of release over the cadence of 10 years of like regular drops for new content. That is that is another reason. I think it's important that a new generation of MMO gamers have not had the opportunity to experience it before. There is a wall of willingness to try a game based on the graphics. I'm just going to say it out loud. Graphics don't make a game. However, graphics can help attract an audience. And for younger, new players who have not seen, and I think this is standard third reason of why older MMOs don't see a lot of new player acquisition from younger generations jumping in, is because their graphics just aren't up to par with some of the other games that are now being made in genres that it's much easier and faster to make new games in. Okay? An MMO lifespan to develop a product is a long time. And not a lot of studios are willing to commit to that amount of time or that money. But the reward can be oh so sweet for those studios. And I'm glad we're seeing now in today's age a little bit more of an embrace for new MMORPG development. Thank goodness we get some new life there. I think that there is going to be a golden opportunity for us as developers to define what the new golden cohort of MMO players are. And I'm going to tell you, we have not seen that largest cohort yet. We have seen the golden cohort continue to age. Now we're in our mid 30s to near 40s, some of us, right? I think we're the golden cohort of that MMORPG genre. And I think that there is going to be an opportunity for an entirely new generation over the course of these next 5 years or so, with some of the new projects that are on the horizon, Ashes of Creation, for us to come along and say, hey, you didn't know what a WoW launch looked like. You didn't know what a Final Fantasy launch looked like. You didn't know what these giant, franchises, that their big launch felt like. And it was a really cool and interesting time to be at the ground floor opportunity of a new MMORPG, especially one with next generation graphics and some intense player agency driven systems. I think that's super cool. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be a sight to behold. Apologize for the language. Margaret,
Yeah.
we got to set the setting to whatever, mature.
Yeah, I only laughed because it resonated, Stephen. But moving on. For this one, wanted to address some concerns around combat becoming more action focused or builder spender. Maybe less of a hybrid combat system. What's the current scope for the combat system that and has Intrepid deviated away from its original goals with it? If so, how?
I wouldn't say that we've deviated. I would say that we've iterated. I would say that, okay, so to reiterate what the current scope for our combat system is a hybrid between tab and action. And what that means is, at its essence, what is the difference between tab and action? Action contains a lot of player-driven skill shots, right? These are me reacting to the situation I'm seeing. They're landing an aimed shot or timing and predictive behavior. It's a lot of fluidity, right? And mobility that's associated there. Obviously, one of the staple, components of action combat is a reticle, to differentiate between the camera modes, of course. Some of us have played tab-targeted games that emphasize those elements as well through templated AoEs, templated targeted AoEs, right? Line attacks. Those types of abilities exist in tab target games as well. What we're trying to do with Ashes of Creation is create a system that blends the two worlds together to a degree and offers players the opportunity to spec into more heavily skill-oriented abilities or tab targeted, have that duality that's represented. So we've changed a little bit about how we approach that over the course of the last several years based off of player feedback. We did some APOC testing around like really core action combat. And we did some testing around Alpha 1. We did some split body iteration. We saw kind of player feedback there with regards to root motion attacks and whatnot. So right now we have a really talented strike team on the combat side that and on the encounter side that are making significant progress, I think, in moving forward the combat designs around Ashes of Creation. You've seen a little bit of this in the tank demonstration. And while it's not quite there yet, it is getting closer to there. And this is probably one of the most subtle driven components of development is combat, because it's the most tactile, because it's the most interfaced with, because it is something you're constantly experiencing. And it's also something that a lot of different people have a lot of different thoughts on, because there's a lot of different games out there that do combat differently. And that's okay, and that's normal. And let's take the best parts of those and incorporate them into what we want to make Ashes as combat identified around. The simple truth of the matter is this, and what people should walk away from this question thinking. We will continue to iterate on combat until it is in a place that collectively we as a community can say, this may not be my particular combat, but this combat is good. That is the driving force and factor behind the development of combat, and that is how we are going to continue to iterate upon it, utilizing, of course, the player feedback from our community, but also keeping you guys informed and up to date as we continually iterate on combat.
All right, my next question is on the character creator. When might we expect to see a new iteration of the character creator? Has the team been concentrating more on polishing the new faces in that we have already seen, or integrating more races with a similar degree of polish?
The character creator is currently scheduled in this milestone, milestone 5, to get brought up to speed with the most recent additions of our races. The additional features that we're talking about with like different hairstyles and decals that can be used, those might not be worked on this milestone. They might not be worked on until next milestone. But I would say in anticipation for Alpha 2, you will expect to see that the character creator is in a usable, functional, and testable, playable format for Alpha 2. It may not have all the bells and whistles, of course, that we want to launch with, but it is going to be a part of the Alpha 2 client that players will get to interface with.
All right. How far are you willing to go in response to player feedback on core systems? For example, if there's a huge outcry at launch to have more instance dungeons and raids, is that something you would address, or are you standing firm on the more open world aspect of it?
Well, let's see here. So to first answer that question, player feedback is important. However, the identity and the vision of the game is not up for discussion. And so when we talk about the core systems, tenets, and philosophies behind what the game that we're trying to make is, we believe that the game we are trying to make resonates with a large enough section of the MMORPG player base that it is a sustainable and profitable venture for us to create that core game. Now, the ancillary systems that live around the core philosophy of Ashes of Creation, or the subtleties in what we need to do in order to make a particular system or feature better, right? That is why we interface with. That is the reason that we want to collect player feedback. The identity of the game, when you leave that up to council design, so to speak, right? That's when you start running into an identity crisis. And I think that if the objective of a particular team is to answer the call of every player, that 10 times out of 10, they're going to fail. And I do not believe that that is the way that you go about creating a product. I think that you identify your golden cohort, you identify your core audience, and you say, hopefully with this sense, I am a member of that core audience. I know what that core audience desires from a 10,000 foot perspective. I am going to build that, right? And you stick with it. And the moment you have voices that come from a board, or that come from an executive, or that come from a monetization guy, and they say, hey, this has made a lot of money over here, let's make some money over here, right? That is when you start running into the problems. That is when you start running into the identity crisis. And that is not up for discussion, so to speak. But as I said, the subtleties of implementation, the iterative portions of a particular feature or system, those are where player feedback matter. And I'm going to tell you, it's a difficult job parsing through feedback. It is a very difficult one. Roshan and Vaknar and Margaret and Peter, they do great jobs on the community side, and not a lot of teams invest money into community teams this early on, and as early as Ashes did. But it's necessary in order to distill the feedback into actionable items. Otherwise, it would be a very difficult thing.
So with server quests that can only be done once and that begin certain events in the game, how will this affect future expansions if two servers don't follow the same major quest paths?
That's a good question. So obviously, when our story arcs have branches, And it depends kind of on the story arc itself, right? We have these major story arcs, we have minor story arcs, we have personal story arcs, stuff like that. They all tie into a meta narrative. And when we are releasing expansions, we throw back to more gross, generalized ideas of a particular story arc. So, for example, if little Timmy dies at the end of one particular story arc, there might be 5 or 6 different ways he could die, depending on which story arc maybe gets interfaced with, or which chapter, how a particular chapter might end. But when we refer back to little Timmy dying versus living in a future expansion, we don't need to get granular in how little Timmy died, right? Out of the 6 possible scenarios, we just need to say, poor little Timmy died. Isn't that sad, right? So in that sense, we keep it as binary, as restricted in the number of ways that it can occur. But in addition, the reality is we're going to be creating new storylines with the future expansions, and we're going to do our best to kind of call back into what a particular story might have been with on a server. But the core the core aspect of these story arcs is to kind of create that unique aspect of player-driven storylines within a particular expansion or launch, and then do our best to call back to them as we release future expansions and redefine particularly those areas.
My question is in regards to character level and artisan level. We know that currently they are 2 separate things. That being said, what prevents a player from staying level 1 and partying up with a level 50 player to then gather level 50 resources in the high zones? That way, anyone who wants to take those resources will have to kill the gatherer who is level 1 and get a large amount of corruption for killing a level 1 as a level 50.
Well, there's a lot that goes with it. First of all, gathering higher level resources requires significant advancement within a particular profession for that gatherable resource. So if I'm a miner and I want to access the highest possible mineral, I need to be a master miner. And in order to achieve the master miner status, I am going to be gaining adventuring level experience through that process, because many of those quest lines, many of those achievements are facilitated through quest lines. Some of those quest lines interface with adventuring difficulties that are out in the wild at certain levels. So that's going to be a predicate for me to achieve a certain level in order to complete some of these quest lines and achieve that master status. So you will likely not see the ability of a level 1 alt character having the access to high level mineral mining or any other type of gatherable out there. That's one thing to prevent it. And then the other thing is, let's see here, higher tiers. So that's the primary method really in which we prevent that. Anyone who wants to take these resources who kills the gatherer will get a large amount of corruption. But the truth of the matter is, if you're killing a gatherer, right, it is going to be entirely possible that a level 30 or 35 person might achieve the rank of master miner and be out in the level 50 areas mining that gatherable. And to a degree, whoever wants to kill them is going to suffer the consequences of a larger amount of corruption gained because of the disparity in level between that character's adventuring level and the character who killed them. And that's part of the disincentivization of the corruption system. And that's part of the novelty of player agency within a particular system like the artisanship one, where maybe my first focus as a player is to level up my master mining profession as quickly as possible, and that exceeds what would naturally have been my character level or adventuring level advancing alongside it. That's, I think, unique. That's, I think, interesting. That is, I think, what players want to have the choice to be able to do if they want to. Oh, and yes, it you guys can't hear this, but we just heard a very lovely Margaret talking to us. So we were like awkwardly silent there for a second. Margaret was talking to us. It's noon, but I'm fine with, continuing kind of this questions if you guys want to keep going a little bit.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I'm down.
I'm enjoying it.
All right. Will there be any perks to leveling in alt once you have a character at max level to make the experience more convenient, such as account-wide rep, mounts, leveling gear, or will each character start from absolute scratch when you start a new one?
Each character will start from scratch. However, with that being said, there are certain account-based considerations that we're making, such as the ability to, share warehouse space between alternate characters on the same account, right? The ability to utilize housing and furniture that might be in the housing and or workstations that might be on a freehold across characters on a particular account. So in that sense, there is a bit of a leg up for players who have achieved things on their primary character. However, at the same time, there should not be like experience boosters and things that kind of hasten the development of that particular. They could share, we are an open economy system, so if they wanted to give them the best gear set for each particular level grade, they players could do that. But that I think is normal. That's what most alt creating characters want to kind of experience, but they'll have to go through and complete all the same quest lines. They'll have to complete the same leveling process. They will have to do what it takes to level up that particular alt.
All right. So the next question that we've got is going to be regarding the class composition and design revolving around the Holy Trinity.
Okay.
Yeah. If that is the case, where does a non-healing support fall into that concept of design, and how will players who choose that path remain relevant throughout the gameplay loops?
Well, this is a bit of a throwback again design. This is a more old school idea of the Holy Trinity and where non-healing support classes fall into that mix. Generally, you see, in my experience, most non-healing support classes fall into between the hybrid of support to tank or support to DPS, right? So they tend to fill a hybrid role. The Bard has an opportunity to fill that space and is a very integral component to maximizing a particular group or archetype's ability to perform through the use of their supportive and buff-oriented abilities. As we've talked in the past, many of these are support based on proximity. Some of them are support based on targeted buffs. We're going to be following the format of abilities that adhere to dances, songs, and stories when it relates to the bard and the scope of their particular ability sets. Each of those provide a certain type of benefit to other characters within proximity. The idea here, again, pointing back to a more old school Trinity design, is that no party is complete without the non-healing support class, which is the Bard in Ashes of Creation. So, that is, I think, a role that a lot of players out there enjoy. And you'll be able to perform as that class in either a DPS or tank oriented, and perhaps even depending on your archetype selection, healing oriented as well. Obviously, not to the degree that a primary archetype cleric would, but yeah.
My next question goes back into the Alpha 2. Do you plan on introducing it all in a steadily compounding way, only adding new features or content, or in a cyclical manner? So certain systems are turned on and off to test, while others are iterated upon and alternately cycled out.
Probably a little of both. I would say it's going to depend on the particular system. So, you'll see drops where we update Alpha 2 and want a lot of focus around one particular system. And in order to make sure that we are seeing that level of interaction, we might disable certain systems or take them down to be iterated upon. The benefit of being in a production environment is that we make releases, and that cadence of our release candidate is predicated on an amount of work done within some number of sprints, gets tested internally QA wise, and then gets promoted out to a production environment. Those will tend to be larger drops for Alpha 2. And so you may see whole systems come online at some different points throughout the Alpha 2 testing, entirely new different areas, entirely new packages of narrative content and POIs. That is going to adhere to kind of what our development schedule and release cadence will look like.
All right. Will dialogue choices have any impact on the quests in regards to how NPCs respond to you, or is the overall outcome of will they have any impact on the quest or regards to how they respond to you, or the overall outcome of that quest, or is it more of just a role-playing perspective without any major impact?
No, the dialogue choices are intended to provide an impact, both with the response of the NPC. It might also serve as predicates for other systems if there are certain paths chosen within the dialogue tree. It might unlock, different side arcs and storylines that other players may not experience. The dialogue trees are not meaningless. They're meant to provide gameplay related context.
So in the last developer live stream, you had mentioned blood magic is an illegal magic, which has us curious. So we've seen elemental and arcane forms of magic, but will players be able to wield blood magic? And what are the different schools of magic you are considering for the game?
So first, when we say that blood magic is illegal, right, we're talking about in the context of a normal everyday player who's a citizen of Verra, having come from Sanctus. You are adhering to the local laws and guidance from nation governments and or node governments, right? To be a good, upstanding citizen of Verra, you adhere to these laws. The ability to wield blood magic might be seen in some storylines. We'll see. That is left to the players to experience and discover. Those types of choices might have ramifications on your character and or ramifications within storylines. There are a lot of different schools of magic. In fact, we haven't released our style guide for like VFX and whatnot, but when we talk about, how do we create a blood corruption setting? Well, what is the associated colors? What's the shape language of blood magic? This flowing river, you saw some of them in the VFX of the zone, and in Carfin, you saw the mist and the deep red, saturation. Each of the environments and the magics and the, what we create has an associated style guide that includes color wheels and palettes across different influences, whether it be, transformation, summoning magic, arcane magic, elemental magic, blood corruption, regular corruption, chaos, electricity. There's a whole bunch of influences that exist across the player abilities, but also across the environments and the POIs, and unique to each of the cultures that require defined style guides associated with them. So that's kind of, we have a lot of different schools of magic that we have in the game. Um, and whether players will be able to wield blood magic is kind of up to the different storylines you all explore.
Going back to Alpha 2, do you plan on introducing all of the primary archetypes before adding the secondary archetype systems into the test? Additionally, once the secondary archetype system is added, will you want to test it with only a few classes at a time, or release all classes available at the point in development?
So we may release some limited scope of the secondary archetype selection and the augmentation system without having all of the base archetypes released in order to test some things. In addition, it's more than likely that we'll be releasing secondary selections one at a time or a few at a time, as opposed to waiting until all are kind of ready to be released for testing, so that we can collect appropriate information from playtesters in as fast a setting as possible.
Do you have any concerns on players eventually discovering a meta server build with nodes due to players heading to specific nodes and regions because they find that content more enjoyable? And if so, how would you go about getting players to shift around the world to break up the meta?
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about that, to be honest, because the way that we facilitate the world kind of taking into account player activity to manifest different story arcs and or world states is based off of population, start location, heat mapping of player movement and activity. A lot of that stuff is built in a way that almost ensures very different outcomes from a world state perspective across different servers. Now, if players had a concerted effort in order to elicit similar world building achievements, it might be possible for them to do so in very bespoke areas, like standing up a node in a particular zone. But that's the first level of interaction when it comes to deciding what content trickles out of these POIs, what supporting structures in the world change the zones. It's not just one level deep. When that node gets manifest, it has a relationship based with other nodes. Some of those relationships get told through the vassal system, some get told through reputation, some get told through, particular initiatives that a node might undertake. And not everything that happens in the world is predicated on a node reaching a certain level. That's one predicate system. There's a whole bunch of predicates that are sprinkled throughout different layers of content, and that need to be achieved in order to elicit a response from the server or from the server world manager. So I'm not too concerned with reaching a quote unquote meta across servers. I think it's going to be possible and expected that players in certain areas will yield similar outcomes to things, and that's okay. That's cool. I think it's interesting if players have a concerted effort across server to interact with one another, learn from their actions, mistakes, successes, and effectuate that on the server they're on. That's interesting. But I don't believe we'll see a meta form. I think that the intricacies are too great when it comes to how predicates are formed in order to elicit world state changes.
So we haven't talked about the Tolnar recently.
The Tonar!
Who do you consider to be the true natives or traditional people of Verra? Could we be seen as foreigners trying to colonize Verra, or would the Tolnar view us differently than that?
How do I want to say this? So I think when we talk about the Tolnar, and we're talking about how will the Tolnar perceive their ancestors, the children's children of their ancestors returning back to Verra. I think majority of the disposition is going to be these are the descendants of those responsible for the tragedy that befell our world. And so that is one way to look at it. And I think that you will see a disparity between the younger Tulnar and the older Tulnar and their reception to those who are coming new. I think that's normal. I think that's expected. I think that creates an interesting tension. And I think that is a nice contextualization to some of the stories that might be told in interfacing between the Tulnar cultures and those of the returning descendants.
How advanced is it going to be? How advanced is going to be the system of hiring and customizing laborers on your Freehold?
Relatively advanced. I think there's a few paths that you can take when it comes to training up those types of NPC aids. What things that they can do. I think there's going to be different tiers and costs associated with higher level assistance on the Freehold. But the same is true for mercenaries that nodes can hire or castles can place with regards to sieges and or wars and or events. Like you have a very base functioning level of mercenaries with set of equipment and skill rotations and behavior trees that are possible at a fundamental level. And then as you upgrade the node's barracks, as you might upgrade, excuse me, you might achieve certain relics that you gain or enact certain policies that allow you to dial up the stats of those mercenaries. The same thing is true for the NPCs that can exist on freeholds, except those might be more predicated to service buildings that relate to artisanship. And that might be one of the reasons why it's beneficial to own a freehold in one particular node versus another, is based off of what amenities are now available to your freehold as a result of that node selection. Hopefully that answers the question. I think we have time. Let's do one more question from each of you.
All right.
Nice.
You spoke in the last stream about how eventually Intrepid would hold off on Unreal Engine updates until post-launch, but didn't state if you were considering to upgrade to 5.2. Is that something you're planning on doing? And if so, what features from it are you planning on utilizing?
Yeah, absolutely. We're nowhere near close to stopping our continued updates with Epic, with Unreal. So 5.2 is on the radar. We might even skip. We might wait to do, based off of the next iteration, 5.21 or 5.3. It just kind of depends. We have a technical team that evaluates what's on the horizon with updates from Epic on Unreal, and we kind of make that decision based off of the team's needs for particular features that might be being released in the future. But usually we want to give Epic the opportunity to release the first version of a particular major update, and then go with the 0.1 version of that, just from a safekeeping perspective.
All right. So are there any mechanics or systems that you wanted to add to the game but haven't because you wanted to ensure that your development schedule stays on track? And if so, what are they?
Oh, yeah. What are they? There's a lot. We, generally when we're doing our internal meetings and reviews and a great idea comes up, we throw it in the backlog post-launch. That's kind of our generally our MO when it comes to great ideas. I mean, because the reality is, as we continue to go through features, we develop those features, we test those features and iterate on those features, a lot of new ideas and opportunities come about for the team to think about, well, wouldn't it be great if this feature actually did this and interacted with another feature over here that did this? And In some situations, we'll evaluate and determine whether or not, that type of interaction is really necessary to demonstrate what the core loop of a particular system might be trying to demonstrate, and we'll make the change as necessary. But in the majority of cases, we try to stay cognizant of, hey, here is our MVP necessary list of core integrated systems in order to achieve the identity of the game that we're looking for and the core gameplay loops that we want players to experience. And we work towards that end from a launch perspective, and anything that's added that sounds good or we want to incorporate, we throw it into the expansion bucket, right? There's an opportunity for us to we need stuff obviously for us to expand upon and for us to continue development post-launch. So that's generally our MO with regards to new ideas and stuff.
Okay. Given that you said that these story arcs are kind of like a module that get placed into the world, do you plan to sell or release your Ashes of Creation themed TTRPG module for other DMs to use?
There's a lot of things I want to do when we launch Ashes. One is, of course, a module that's set in the world of Ashes of Creation. Yes, I would love to release a throwback to the original campaign. It's very different from where Ashes of Creation is today. But I think there's a lot of overlap between gamers who enjoy tabletop RPGs and MMOs, and one of the benefits of telling a story through different venues, mediums, and systems is that you reach a broader audience because not all of us like the same things. And I think the story of Ashes is a rich one. And because of that, telling it through multiple mediums is definitely a desire. From a board game perspective, I'm a huge board game nerd. I love playing board games. A lot of us at the office do. I would love to tell the story of Ashes through a board game as well. I would love to tell the story of Ashes through a RTS. I would love to tell it through film and television. There's a lot of ways I think that the story can be told. It doesn't all have to be focused around the return to Verra. There's a lot of different opportunities across the many thousands of years of timeline that Verra's existed that we can tell the story, and even other aspects of that. So yeah, to answer your question, the desire is a yes post our flagship product launch, which is the MMO.
All right. How exactly does the Constellation system work? You've stated that it'll be very relevant to the system, such as narrative, empowering abilities and items, and gathering relics, but how do they tie into these systems exactly?
So the Constellation system is another predicate system. And when I say it's a predicate system, it means that certain conditions will yield certain constellations being available to pursue, discover, and achieve. And they span the realm of interfacing across adventuring level, artisanship, node, relics, policies. Like there's a lot of different things that constellations can touch because at its essence, it is a predicate system. Now, once players have achieved identifying a certain location that yields a constellation, and they've checked off that box, okay, I have achieved this thing, it can serve its purpose for kicking off a new storyline for that individual, kicking off a new storyline for that individual's micro communities or pseudo factions if necessary, right? It can serve as a broader kickoff. One person discovers it, 300, 400, 500 people get to participate now in it. That's an opportunity. It can yield the location of an achievable world relic that can be brought back home to a particular node. There's a lot of different things that are possible. In order to see the constellation and to actually achieve that, it could be just as simple as looking at your character's viewport into the night sky at a certain location at a certain time. It could be far more in depth, which is killing a certain raid boss for a particular number of times until it drops a particular item that yields a map that sends you to a location that stands as a like. There's a lot of different layers that can get added on. How do we manifest a particular constellation? The intent here is to provide an immersive system that keeps the player in the world and allows their in-world movement and interactions and immersiveness to yield a result that's unique. And that, I think, is a fun and compelling interaction, especially as it relates to adventuring. Was that our last question? Oh, we have one more. We have one final question. What do we got?
Apologize. Had a technical issue there. So as it stands, final question. What is the biggest obstacle preventing Intrepid Studios from being ready to begin Alpha 2 testing?
The biggest obstacle. I think right now it's content production. I think our obstacle is the sheer size and complexity of our systems, of course, the necessary time for our teams to complete the content to fill those systems, so that the data that we collect from playtesting those particular loops is compelling and indicative of accurate player responses and player activity. So there is a certain level to which the Alpha 2 client and world and experience must be brought in order for us to facilitate the accurate collection of data that we can then inform decisions based off of. And that is a moving point. We're going right now. We have on paper in our production schedule of what that needs to be. But as we approach the end of milestones and or sprints, and we do our inspect, review, reflect process, we get to re-articulate where that point lives, because each of those is a touch point. So look, we're building a massive MMO, massive, to the likes of which I'm not sure have been done in a fantasy setting before at launch. Now we have brought aboard a phenomenal team, incredibly talented. We are doing it in a way that I think is right, with the transparency and connectivity to the community and the opportunity for people to watch and the development of it. And the truth of the matter is that all of us want to play the game. All of us want to play Ashes, even if it's just Alpha 2. So, our focus is to continue down the path of production and completing what's necessary for us to have a successful Alpha 2 test. And nothing can be said or done to hasten that process in a manner that is not already conducive to how we are approaching production towards Alpha 2 already. So with that in mind, patience is key. Spending the time necessary is always going to be a good yield on investment. And I think that being a part of the journey is beneficial both to the project and to you guys as players. But ultimately, our focus will remain on the obstacle of producing the necessary content for us to achieve a meaningful test period with Alpha 2. Yay! We did it! Thank you, and content plug. I like the typing. Guys, is that Margaret in the back? I like that. That's cool. Guys, I want to thank each of you for joining me today. Obviously, you guys represent a very core audience section of the Ashes of Creation community. People have been following the project for a long time. Hopefully excuse me, I apologize for the coughing. Hopefully, the questions that you asked today, I think, successfully scratched some of the outstanding itches that the community has with regards to systems design and the project and development as a whole. I always enjoy chatting with fellow MMO lovers and members of our community, of course, about, sometimes I can get a little overly passionate. I apologize about that as well. But, I always enjoy having these conversations. But I'd love each of you guys to just kind of give a quick reminder to our audience of where they can find you guys and your communities. And yeah.
I'm Chibi Bree. I'm from the Golden Feather Tavern, and you can find us anywhere /TGF Tavern. So Twitch, YouTube, etc.
And you can find me over on YouTube at youtube.com/RichieSH.
Yeah, and to catch up with myself or any of the Pathfinders, just go to asheshq.com or the corresponding YouTube where the Pathfinder podcast is at, or you can catch me on my own channel on YouTube, not YouTube, but Twitch, just some work. So
Awesome. Well, from everybody here that joined me today and all of you out in the audience, thank you very much for coming and being a part of this. We love and appreciate our community at Ashes of Creation, and your guys' participation makes this game a better game. So with that being said, we will see you again at the end of this month when we showcase the new Mage update. And until then, I wish you guys the most amazing April, and we will chat with you all soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
y'all.